Let's get started. We got a lot to talk about. This is Christ in Capital. Love God, love neighbor, build something. Let's go. Before we get started, I want to read this chapter or this selection of verses from the book of Isaiah. It's Isaiah chapter 1, verse 21 through 23. How the faithful city has become a whore, she who was full of justice. Righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your best wine mixed with water. Your princes are rebels and companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and runs after gifts. They do not bring justice to the fatherless, and the widow's cause does not come to them. Whew, man. I think I hear echoes of that at least rhyme with America in there. So let's get started. Let's get talking. We're going to be talking about the stimulus bill that was just passed and whether or not inflation is going to result from this stimulus package. But before we do that, go to all our socials, like, subscribe, go to Patreon, join us. For $3 a month, you can have your business advertised on the show. Lots of other benefits on there, t-shirts, ask questions to us, me and Nathan. Oh, by the way, it's just going to be me today. Nathan's not here. So no one to dig me out of these awkward side trails that I get on. So this is going to be fun. So let's get started. Everyone, I think, that I know of, or at least most people, are going to get something from this stimulus bill. And I think that's great. A lot of people are really happy about it. But I think there's a lot of people who are really in tune with the economic matters and are pushing this idea that we're going to experience inflation, right? And theoretically, I think, yes, I personally think probably, but the way that I think a lot of people are talking about it is a little simplistic. And so I want to, with this episode, talk about how we as Christians should be communicating this idea in the, common areas like social media and just social settings. Because I think if we cry inflation too much and it never happens, we're going to discredit ourselves. So we need to be careful. And I want to kind of give us a way of thinking about that topic. And I think a really easy but sophisticated way of talking about it with our friends. And so just stay tuned. We're gonna talk about that. But first, this stimulus package is called the American Rescue Bill. Don't you think it's funny how anytime the government names a bill, they always name it in such a way that if you disagree with it, you're the bigot or the jerk, the really awful person, right? The American Rescue Act. Who can disagree with that? The No Child Left Behind policy, right? The Patriot Act, the Equality Act, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about that. Who can disagree with these things? Anyone who is actually listening to or reading these things and in tune with what's in these packages can genuinely take a second look at this, or they can kind of hesitate on these things. But the first time you hesitate, someone's going to be looking at you going like, you're a jerk, right? Why are you against the American Rescue Act or the Equality Act, right? So you got to be able to talk intelligently about these things and communicate why you're in disagreement with these things. This specific bill is filled with a lot of fluff. I think they call it pork. I don't know why they call it pork. I don't know. But there's a lot of junk in here that has nothing to do with stimulus. I don't think that nothing in the package has anything to do with quote unquote stimulus. It's not stimulating anything. But there's a lot of stuff in here that's just really unrelated. There's money in here related to, it's dedicated to preserving Native American languages, certain Native American languages. Awesome cause. I'm sure, that's great. We should. That's great. But why does the government have anything to do with that? There's other things in here about, there's a lot of school funding, which I'm going to get a lot of flack, but school funding should be tied to whether or not you're going to be reopening, right? I think there's probably something in there about you have to have a plan to reopen, but there's no like stipulations about reopening. It's just we're funding you. So essentially you could be funding a school that's planning to stay locked down, stay out of business, right? How about no? And I'm not totally sure, but I think it was, if it's just K to 12 education that this funding is kind of committed to, from what I calculated, it'd be like $1 million a school, which I don't think that's right. If it is, that's insane. So if it includes college funding, university education, trade school, stuff like that, maybe it's a little bit better. But still, it's a ton of money. It's a ton of money for schools that are planning to stay locked down. No. One of the other things that's in here is funding for certain governments. A lot of them are blue. And I think that's one of the things that's most frustrating to me. For the past couple years or so, a lot of conservatives have been sitting back waiting for these certain really liberal governments to fall through, right? Because their policies are they throw out so many like crazy promises. We'll give you all of this stuff, so many promises, so many, lofty, goals and all this stuff. And we're just, we're sitting back like, economically, it doesn't make sense. You're going to run your state or your locality into the ground. And because you just want to, save face? You want to, for 4 years, seem like the nice guy or the kind of compassionate guy? No, you've got to think long term. But these governments don't think like that. And we know, we've seen the clock ticking. We've seen the trail that they're going down. And we've thought, you know what? Maybe these governments need to see. Maybe they need to experience bankruptcy. Maybe they need to experience the effects of terrible economic policy, and then they'll realize that they should be pursuing more free market. They should be pursuing more freedom for image bearers of God to actually go out and steward God's creation well, to provide value to society, all of those kind of things. But as it is right now, they're just kind of running it into the ground, and we've been sitting back saying, just wait. They'll see one day. And now a federal government comes in and they've hijacked this disaster scenario, this virus scenario, and funded all these governments that have been running those terrible policies for the past, so many years. And it's like, what have you done? You've let them sit in their terrible policies, and you've validated their terrible policies. No, stop. And so it's frustrating. It frustrates me. For instance, Illinois, is it Clark County? I think it's Clark County, the county that Chicago's in. Pension funds, horribly, massively underfunded because they give out these lofty pension plans, expecting these historic returns on these plans, on these funds, indefinitely into the future. No stop, just historic record returns. And you're like, this is not sustainable. You can't do this. You're going to fail. And then the government comes in and throws all this money on them. You're like, ugh. I don't want them to hurt. I don't want them to be miserable, but I want them to see the consequences of their bad economic policies. Now we're just going to throw it in there and validate all the decisions they've been making. And on top of that, think about how government funding or budgeting works, right? You're in government budgeting, you just budget to increase the budget each year, right? So for schools, okay, if we're at $70 million this year, I'm just throwing a number out there. I don't know. If you're at $70 million this year, let's say $80 million next year, right? And then throughout the year, as you go on and they say, actually, we're going to have a budget cut next year. They're not saying a budget. They're not saying they're cutting the budget. They're saying they're decreasing the increase in their budget. So this year they're at 70 million. Next year they're planning to be at 80 million, and they cut it back to 77 million, and they say, actually, we've had a budget cut this year, so we're bumping it down to 77 million. It's like, no, that's not a budget cut. That's a decrease in the increase, right? And so now these governments have this money flooding in from the federal government, and next year they're just going to expect that that's their new baseline, and they're just going to increase from there. No, that's terrible. I think I've said this before on the podcast, but same thing with the military. Military gets a certain budget each year. They buy a whole bunch of ammo and supplies and stuff like that. At the end of the year, when they realize that, or near the end of the year, when they realize that they still have ammo left over, what do? They go out and use it all up, because next year, if they don't, their budget's going to get reduced back down, right? So you need to use up your whole budget, and if anything, go over, request more, so that next year you get more budgets or more in your budget. And it's just so frustrating. This the Biden administration has kind of hijacked this virus scenario and validated all of the economic decisions that these terrible governments have made. And it's frustrating. I understand there's sensitivity. We need to be sensitive. We need to be caring. There was a terrible virus situation. Trump's administration did the same thing, throwing a whole bunch of money into the economy. Terrible. I personally think that the Trump administration had a little more, it was a little more expected, just because we're in the heat of the coronavirus situation. But right now, we're coming out of the coronavirus thing, and we're throwing $1.9 trillion on this situation. This is not good. This is not good. And so that kind of leads me into the next thing. Yes, this bill, or this bill is going to be funded by an increase in the money supply. There's lots of ways that you can fund bills like this. You can issue a whole bunch of treasuries. You can debt finance. You can do all this stuff, but you can also print money, right? And that's largely what's happening with this bill. If you guys do me a favor, go and look at the M1 money stock chart. Just go look at it. I posted it on my Instagram story a couple days ago. If you look at that, there's a from like 1960 or however long ago it was. I think it was somewhere around there. You just see this steady increase over time. Steady increase in the money supply, which is expected. In 2020, this thing hockey sticks. So it goes like, here, let me show you. It goes like this. It goes straight up, right? And so anyone who's looking at this, who has any cursory glance of, or cursory kind of experience with economics or knowledge of economics, is looking at this and they're like, we're ripe for inflation, right? Ripe for inflation. And I'm sitting back, I'm like, yeah, makes sense. In theory, that's how it works. Milton Friedman, I think, puts it best. He says, inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. Okay? It's a really great way to think about it, in my opinion. But I want to give us another way of thinking about it as well, because I don't think that necessarily captures all of the information that needs to be taken into consideration. So yes, too many dollars chasing too few goods. Will inflation happen? I think if you're just looking at it from a 30,000 foot level, yes, of course, right? But let's think about it this way. If you have a society that's producing a certain amount of goods, a nation that's producing this certain amount, right? And it has a certain amount of dollars that represent a claim to those goods, right? You've got this ratio going on, right? If I increase the dollar supply and keep the productivity the same, well, prices are going to increase. The dollar's going to inflate, right? Because that production has to be divided out into more dollars, right? And it's a weird way to think about it. It's probably not a way you've thought about it in the past, but I think it's a good way to think about it, right? That productivity has to be divided out among more dollars. Your numerator has increased, your denominator stayed the same, right? That's how inflation happens, right? But the inflation only happens if, when you increase the money supply, your transactions and the economy is still churning. It's still churning. It's still going. Think about it this way: if you're a seller, the only way you know to increase your prices is if more demand is coming in the door. If you're seeing an increase in your purchases, in your sales, and all that stuff, that's how you know how to increase your prices or decrease them, right? And so when any sort of government increases their money supply, what's going to happen is sellers are going to see more demand coming in their doors, and they're going to increase their money supply, right? That's just how it works. That's how inflation happens. Let's say you have a bill, a bill like this one. You increase the money supply drastically, but you've locked down your society. Reduced capacity in all restaurants, all stores, across the board. You've reduced all of that stuff. Transactions are at a low. Is there going to be inflation? Probably not, right? The sellers don't know that there's more demand. They're just, they know, they can see in the news that the money supply has increased, but they're not seeing that in their business. People have taken that money and they've thrown it into their bank accounts. And so you've got this increase in the money supply. And the productivity, the denominator, not only has it stayed the same, or it didn't stay the same, it actually decreased, right? And so you've got this weird scenario where a ton more quote-unquote demand, which a lot of times economists call demand, or they call the increase in dollars increase in demand, which is like, whatever. And you've decreased your productivity. That's a recipe for disaster, in my opinion. Whether it's inflation or whatever other economic travesty that comes about because of it, it's not good. What you want, and this is the way I think we should be thinking about it, what you want is a 1-to-1 ratio. You want a ratio that equals 1. If you increase the money supply, let's increase productivity. This is why a lot of investment advisors expect a 2% increase in inflation each year when you're talking about the returns on your investments, on your 401ks, all that stuff. They'll say, hey, we're gonna adjust for inflation, and they'll put a 2% kind of reduction in there, a 2% kind of coefficient in there to kind of adjust everything for the prices, because what the government does is it expects that we're going to have 2% increase in productivity, and so we increase the money supply a little bit, right? That's kind of what's going on. But what we want to track with a 1% ratio. And so just think about it that way. You have an increase in money supply, but a decrease in productivity. It's not good. It's a recipe for disaster. And so I don't think we should be scared to death about inflation. But I think we should not be surprised if it does happen. If we do start seeing money supply or inflation occur. So just be forewarned. Just be aware. Start thinking about these things, inflation in that way, right? In terms of increase in money supply versus productivity, right? We want to think about it in those ways and start communicating it in those ways. Just because we're increasing the money supply does not mean that there's going to be inflation. There's more to it. Usually that's the case. But we're in this weird situation where productivity is actually going down, or it has gone down. It's being suppressed, and the money supply is increasing. Now, as COVID restrictions start to relax and people are ramping back up, maybe there's some pent up demand that's kind of push us into a really productive period. Who knows? We don't know. But I think one of the biggest things that we need to take away from this is that governments can't stimulate growth in an economy. They can't stimulate an economy by printing money. They can't stimulate an economy at all. Well, the only way that they could stimulate an economy is by going away, just stepping back, hands off, let people be productive, right? The best stimulator for an economy is productive people, right? We talk about it all the time on this show, Christ in Capital. Love God, love neighbor, build something. Love the Lord. Realize that what he told us to do in the garden was to steward his creation well. That means no matter what situation you're in, right? No matter whether you're, a millionaire in a penthouse in New York City, or you're in the slums of Chicago, be faithful and efficient and productive with the things that you have now. Be faithful. Be productive. Love God. Love your neighbor. Build it, right? And I think there's something in the fabric of nature, but also in economies where the economies that are going to flourish are the ones that are the government takes a backseat role, and the individual and the family and the local community take a front seat role in productive endeavors. They are the ones going out and using the raw materials of the creation, using their resources, their skills, their hobbies, their interests, all of this stuff to bring God's glory into all areas of life, specifically the market, the economy, serving their neighbor, loving their neighbor, in pursuit of the profit motive, because when you pursue the profit motive, you're gaining resources for your family and your own community so that you can serve them. That's how economies thrive. That's how economies, are lifted up. That's how wealth is created in a society, and we need to think about it that way, right? We are not mindless matter bing-banging on the surface of the cosmos, as Jeff Durbin says, just looking to survive, right? We're not just kind of doing this whole economic thing so that we can get by, so that we can consume and then die. That's not who we are. That's not our task as image bearers, right? We are to be productive, to steward God's creation well, to image him. In the beginning, what did he do? He took darkness. He took the formless and the void, and he formed it, and he filled it. That's who we are. That's what we're called to be. That's what we're called to do. Take all of this stuff that we see around us and use it to create something beautiful, good, true, lovely. Be a creator, right? That's what an economy is. Serving your neighbor with your craft, with your skill, all of that, right? That's how an economy is going to thrive. It does not thrive by an institution that is disinterested in the economic landscape, for one, because they don't depend, their funds do not depend on them providing for their neighbor. Their funds depend on the promises they give, whether or not they are they remain faithful to their promises or not. So we are creators. We are producers. We are supply-siders, if I might say, and might get some of my my friends a little upset. We're producers. Okay. So what's the application here? Someone asked me that on social media the other day, and I was like, I posted something. I think it was just the Bible verse, Isaiah 21 through 23. He said, okay, what's the application? And I'm like, well, I should have thought about that before I posted this so that when someone asks, I could tell them. But I think the main application is that we as Christians need to be committed and we need to be invested in the economic discussion, right? Economics is so important. We talk about social justice and we talk about issues of law and order and all this stuff that are important. They really are, because they affect human lives and all that stuff. And it's easy to see how these things affect the individual, personally. But if you look back over history, especially the 20th century, there is not an area of of human experience that has caused more death than bad economic decisions. It's true. Economics is the number one cause of death in the 20th century, probably throughout the rest of society too, or the rest of history. Right? You don't believe me? It's true. Right? Communism kills. Socialism kills. Tyrannical governments kill. Fascist governments kill. So, just let's start thinking about it in those terms. And let me draw back to the Isaiah passage. There's a lot of sections in the scripture where this verbiage that I referenced earlier in the episode, this verbiage about the unfaithful city is used to describe a city that is unfaithful to the Lord, that has turned its back on the Lord. And the things that the scriptures use to describe these cities, like Babylon, Egypt, Jerusalem during Jesus' time. Revelation, it talks about Jerusalem as well. Well, Jerusalem, it uses Babylon imagery. But the idea is that the city that turns its back on God, its silver, I don't know if you guys caught this, its silver becomes dross. What is dross? Dross it just means that the metal has become diluted. It's not pure, right? It's filled with this filler. It's not as valuable, right? What happens in inflation? We increase the money supply. That money gets diluted because it has to lay claim on the same amount of resources, right? Yeah. Silver has become dross. The next section says, your wine is mixed with water. Same concept. Wine mixed with water, it's diluted. Right? It's not as pure. It's not as lovely. Right? It's not as... It doesn't produce the same sort of pleasure that wine is supposed to give us. Right? My Baptist friends are getting a little upset. Speaking of wine having pleasure in it, I guess. But yeah, so just when a city is unfaithful to the Lord, when a nation is unfaithful to the Lord, it gets rulers that go after bribes. It gets rulers that are corrupt, right? Its citizens become robbers. Its silver becomes dross. Its wine is mixed with water. These are images of in my mind, these are images of hell. Your wine is terrible. Your money is worthless. Your rulers are corrupt. Your citizens are thieves. Changed my mind. So, I think we need to start, especially as Christians, we need to start thinking intelligently about these things. Economics is a big player in the scripture, right? It's a big player, and it's a big. It goes downhill when we turn our back on the Lord. So what do we as Christians need to do? We need to pray. We need to repent. We need to love God. We need to love our neighbor. And we need to build something. I'll talk to you guys later.